It was one of the most fiercely fought battles in the Pacific during the Second World War, and the Battle of Okinawa resulted in a victory for the Allies, but at a huge cost. The American casualties for the battle reached almost 50,000, with over 12,000 killed or listed as missing, and there were a number of soldiers who were awarded the Medal of Honor for their brave actions during it. The Battle of Okinawa has been known as a typhoon of steel, and the Americans faced intense kamikaze attacks and ruthless fighting from their enemy, and it's believed that at least 150,000 Okinawan people were killed or went missing. But one part of the battle which is not the most well documented is the fate that many women of Okinawa suffered at the hands of the Americans and also the Japanese forces. They underwent a brutal ordeal at the hands of those during the battle, and they were subjected to a significant amount of assault, especially at the hands of the US forces. Today we look at the torture of the women of Okinawa, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Some of the islands that saw major battles in the Pacific during the Second World War were uninhabited and they had been evacuated, but Okinawa had a large civilian population, many of whom were indigenous. The US believed that there were around 300,000 civilians who lived there, but following the 82-day campaign against the island, there were allegedly 142,058 bodies recovered, and this included many civilians who were pressed into service by the Japanese army. During the fighting, the American soldiers found it difficult to distinguish between civilians and also enemy combatants and soldiers, and they would shoot at the houses on Okinawa. One former soldier wrote, "There was some return fire from a few of the houses, but the others were probably occupied by civilians, and we didn't care. It was a terrible thing not to distinguish between the enemy and women and children. Americans always had great compassion, especially for children. Now we fired indiscriminately." When the Japanese army faced defeat, many people took their own lives, and they believed that falling into the hands of their enemy was the ultimate humiliation and embarrassment for their family. They had learned stories of victorious American soldiers who went on assaulting sprees doing whatever they wanted to the women, and this was the case in Europe also, with the advancing Soviet forces in the final days of the war. They also gained a fearsome reputation, and thousands of civilians on Okinawa were brainwashed by the Japanese propaganda, and they were told that the Americans were there to commit terrible crimes against them. There were many members of the US Army who assaulted Okinawan women during the battle and after. One historian claimed about the large-scale assault that, soon after the US Marines landed, all the women of the village on a peninsula fell into the hands of American soldiers. At the time there were only women, children and old people in the village, as all the young men had been mobilised for the war. Soon after landing, the Marines mopped up the entire village, but found no signs of Japanese forces. Taking advantage of the situation, they began hunting for women in broad daylight, and those women who were hiding in the village or in nearby air raid shelters were dragged out one after another. There were many investigations at the end of the Second World War that did uncover incidents of large-scale assault by the invading forces. A number of elderly people who had lived throughout the battle stated that following the US victory, there were 3 armed Marines who kept coming to their village every week to gather all the local women. These were then carted off to the hills and subjected to terrifying ordeals. This story was considered a dark and long secret. The Japanese forces at the time did not tend to focus their mentality towards these incidents which their enemies had been accused of, and it was claimed that up to 10,000 Okinawan women were subjected to this sort of behaviour at the hands of the Americans. It was a subject that was poorly documented in the history books at the time, but locals recounted many accounts of this sort of behaviour and horror, and some were not willing to talk about what had happened. A number of local books created after the war, and also diaries found, spoke of these shocking incidents. There were in fact less than 10 reported cases in Okinawa, and this was due to a number of reasons, including shame and disgrace, and also because the Americans were the victors and the occupiers, and women believed they could not report the terror to others. It was also claimed that, in all, there were probably thousands of incidents, but the victims' silence kept another dirty secret of the campaign. There were also a number of American Okinawan babies that were born in the time after the battle, but many of these women, shockingly, who found out they were pregnant, were killed, or they were left behind and forgotten about by society and by their villagers because of the shame of having children with the enemy. There were even some radical incidents where victims underwent illegal and rough surgical procedures to deal with this consequence. Many women were very embarrassed because of their treatment, and if they did report their fate to the US military police, they seemingly have been ignored. One Japanese historian documented the story of many of the women of Okinawa during the battle and then the subsequent occupation, and she alleged that even children became victims, and there was in her work roughly 350 crimes documented involving the Americans. One incident involved a woman in April 1945 being abducted when she was evacuating, and another states that a woman who had 2 children was assaulted when she was washing laundry at her home near to a well, and she then gave birth to a boy, presumably the offspring of the US serviceman who terrorised her. There were other incidents in which a 27-year-old woman who was travelling on her way home from work was pushed into a ditch and set upon by 4 men, and this sort of action led to the creation of a civic group known as the Okinawan Women Against Military Violence. Local women knew of many others who remained silent about their suffering, and chose not to do anything, fearful of further action against them. The incidents did not stop when the Second World War came to an end either. Following the Japanese surrender in September 1945, American troops remained as occupying forces, and there were many more accounts of this sort of behaviour continuing. This became so much of a problem in occupied areas that the Japanese government established the Recreation and Amusement Association, which was practically a network of military brothels which catered to the Allied soldiers. These plunged thousands of young women into service in the brothels, and many were forced to see many dozens of men each day. With this, strangely, the accounts of assault went down, but many of these women were treated like comfort women, women who were forced into slavery servicing soldiers during the conflict. One historian claims that the majority of the incidents may have taken place in the northern region, where the fighting and campaign was much less intense, and the American soldiers in the south were experiencing a tougher battle, and many were much more exhausted. He also claimed that the soldiers who landed for occupational duties, rather than the frontline fighters, were the ones who committed more of the attacks. There were in 2023 46 sets of female remains discovered on Okinawa, and these remains dated back to the Second World War. It's believed that these women were either killed in battle or died after being asked to help the army, but there is also a belief that these women could have been local civilians and even Korean comfort women brought to Okinawa to be used by the Japanese military. Those people on Okinawa who did decide to try and live throughout the occupation often found that the American forces in some cases treated them relatively well. However, the women of Okinawa were targeted by a number of soldiers and were subjected to torture ordeals. There had been mass assault on the island conducted by the Japanese forces beforehand, but there were many more stories told in the decades after the war of the horrors that the women faced at the hands of the Americans. This is a forgotten part of the Second World War and what took place in the Pacific, and many would not speak about their ordeal due to the sheer shame that they believed they had around their treatment. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.